Let's dig a little bit deeper into Shakespeare's Hypocrites, the Vickers article. So I gave in the previous video, check that out if you haven't. I talked a little bit about Vickers' analysis of the big picture and this notion of a dynamic hypocrisy, right? One that's not just having someone dissimulating in a static sense where they kind of throw a tarp over themselves and you think that they are other than they are, but where a person's dissimulation is a very active process. Their hypocrisy is very active. And here we're going to see how Shakespeare explores not only the notion of a dynamic hypocrisy, but its sources in corruption and the fact that it can spread. So hypocrisy is something that we can spread around, and we'll see like Iago is pretty good at that. All right, so let's recall that in Measure for Measure, we saw Isabella's response to Angelo, right, and his hypocrisy when he's like, gives her the lewd proposal, and then she says, no, I'm not taking you up on that to save my brother or whatever, and he's like, yeah, well, okay, fine, your brother's going to be in deep trouble unless you do, and then she's like, well, I'm going to expose you, and he's like, yeah, what are you going to do? I have this great reputation and I have everything stacked in my favor and you have nothing. And she's like, oh, seeming, I'm going to expose you. And he's like, that's not going to work. But we did see in the end that hypocrisy was exposed in Measure for Measure. I think the remaining plays, once we move into Hamlet and Coriolanus, and especially these real I think all Shakespeare's plays are heavy hitters, but you get into the monster plays like the Macbeth, the Othello, and then the crushing King Lear. This is where Shakespeare, gets even darker about what he thinks that people are capable of. So people are capable of pretty good things, and they're capable of pretty rotten things. Okay, so just before we get into that, Hamlet, is there's lots of stuff about hypocrisy in Hamlet. There's so much about it in Shakespeare, where Hamlet, one of his great lines is "Smile and be a villain," right? And then in his treatment with the Prince Hal plays, the Henry plays, the great character Falstaff. I mean, how can you not love Falstaff? This old kind of big drunken layabout guy that is sort of this corrupting influence, but he's kind of fun, and he's just a big party, literally a giant party animal. And he's just sort of this drunken guy, and he's always making outrageous claims about how brave he is, which of course everyone knows is not true. And they make all kinds of jokes about him, and it's Elizabethan humor, so it's pretty bawdy stuff. Bawdy, but they make cracks about his appearance constantly, and it's quite amusing, and Falstaff seems kind of like this big goofball. And so he's a funny kind of a hypocrite. We find his hypocrisy utterly amusing, and so does everybody around him. And then eventually, Hal and his great line, yeah, like I'm going to reject you someday, Falstaff. It's coming. And all of a sudden, it just kind of gets darker. And of course, when Falstaff really is the source of corruption, well, it's not that funny anymore. And eventually, he dies. He dies off scene, off stage, if you will. And then there's this legend that Queen Elizabeth loved Falstaff so much that she told Shakespeare, "You better bring him back." And he did in The Merry Wives of Windsor. I'm not sure if that's really true. It's a great story. I mean, if Queen Elizabeth says to you as a playwright, "I like that character. He's not really dead. You're going to write another play about him," you probably would. But whether or not that's true, I'm not really sure. Maybe some days the historians will sort that out. Anyways, Coriolanus, another monster heavy hitter of a play by Shakespeare. This is, about, set in antiquity, and it's involving the politics of antiquity, but it resonates with us today. Coriolanus is, being sort of pushed to be in an election, sort of like a soldier in an election. And, one sides want to push him into power, get him elected. Another side says, no, he's a big threat. The standard motif of somebody in power who might get elected, who is a giant threat, and that his proponents are like, nah, he's not a threat, he's going to be great, and all that kind of stuff. And so what Shakespeare does is shows us through all this difficulty that Coriolanus has and all the complexities, just the levels of hypocrisy that are fueled by corruption in the political realm. But of course, that can apply to, a variety of places where there's politics, and there's pretty well always politics. Okay, so in the remainder, next three sections, we look at Macbeth, Othello, and King Lear. Now, in Macbeth, we go on and like desire is right up front in Macbeth, in the play, right? Right away, we see very early on that Macbeth's desire is like swelling, and Shakespeare often uses the term swelling, this swelling up, right? And he's like, what's going on here? If I'm kind of a good guy, why do I have, and haven't we all experienced this? I think I'm a good person. Why am I having this terrible desire? And the terrible desire is to kill the king. Now, you might think of it like, like an assassination and whatnot. But this in Elizabethan times, the idea of regicide, like killing a king, that's just wildly over the top. That violates metaphysical orders, all kinds of things, because politics and theology were so intertwined. I mean, it is in certain places in our own time as well, but probably not really on the level the way it was there, right? So the idea of wanting to kill your king, like the anointed one of God and all that stuff. Wow, that would have been super shocking for an Elizabethan audience. But in the end, Macbeth, it's ultimately exposed, right? Through all these machinations of the play, Macbeth is his hypocrisy, right? We watch how hypocritical he is, and the stories he tells, and the lies and all that, trying to mask his lust for power with the poor king and all that stuff after the deed is done. But in the end, he's exposed. So Shakespeare exposes the hypocrisy in the end, and links it, definitely to evil. So there's a strong theme of hypocrisy and evil being linked. But ultimately, evil in the form of hypocrisy is self-defeating. So you can say, Vickers says, that there's some sort of comfort. Well, as bad as it gets, evil is self-defeating. And that's not actually an uncommon moral position, that that evil in the end will contain the seeds of its own destruction, whereas the goodness doesn't necessarily. It can, but it's more contingent, whereas evil always seems to burn itself out. And that seems to be, I guess, a comforting thought, if as Vickers might say. It's less comforting when we look at Othello, right? Othello, another very complex play and very upsetting play if you really look at it, because there's so much stuff going on in Othello, notions of race, notions of desire and jealousy and all the stuff that Shakespeare is just a master at writing. So I think it's probably a more complicated play, and I think it's more upsetting than Macbeth, because it doesn't. In some ways, it might be more relatable because it doesn't have all the metaphysical stuff that Macbeth does, right? The witches and all that stuff. It doesn't really have that. It's much more on this plane where we live. And that's bad enough, right? So it deals largely with Iago. I mean, there's various ways you can look at it, but it's largely the destruction of Othello through this master manipulator, one of the most evil kind of craftsmen in Shakespeare, Iago, right? Really tour de force of a personality. And he's like, I can do what I want because I can get Othello to, holds me well, thinks highly of me, and the better my purpose shall be served. And so we watch Iago, right, have all these double meanings as he's dealing and manipulating people around until he manipulates and gets other people. So in a sense that Iago is such a powerful kind of evil hypocrite that he can spread hypocrisy. He's like, it's totally toxic, right? And we say this, he's a toxic person or whatever. He gets other people to be awful, right? Macbeth, not so much. But Iago just makes other people awful around them. And they become awful, and they become hypocrites, and they become, suspicious that that not only do they become hypocrites, but they start seeing hypocrisy everywhere. Othello starts seeing it. He loses his trust in people. He loses his trust in his beloved Desdemona, thinks that she's doing all kinds of things, cheating and all stuff, until eventually, he does the horrific ending where he kills her, and then he figures out he's been duped, but then Othello kind of takes responsibility for being duped. It's awful, but extremely interesting play and profound insights into the way human beings behave. But for our purposes here, it's you know, the notion that Shakespeare is exploring is that the hypocrite is so dangerous because not only can they manipulate and let you think things about them, they can get you to be hypocritical. They can get you to see other people as hypocritical who are not actually being hypocrites. So they're toxic in the sense that you just add them to the mix and the whole thing becomes, the whole environment becomes toxic. That's masterwork of Shakespeare constructing this vicious character, Iago. And Iago is kind of always hidden from other people. Macbeth is kind of exposed. Iago's not really exposed except to the audience. You know, so we do kind of get kind of a God's eye view of it, of how toxic something can be. And the person who does it is never truly exposed as doing it, even though people can meet with a nasty end, but they're not really exposed as a hypocrite. So the notion of exposure doesn't really carry over as much. Anyways, very complicated play. And that great line where he says, you know, I'll make Desdemona's virtue, right, appear like pitch, which is this tarry kind of substance, and you go from this nice, beautiful sort of thing that she is, and all that, and virtuous, and I'll get people to see her, like a real notion of Iago as a poisoner, like when we say, you know, poison people, you get people to see awful things, you poison them, because poisons will affect how your senses work. So Iago's hypocrisy is a poison. Yeah. Great stuff, wicked stuff, but very interesting. All right, so there's a bit about Othello. Okay, another big play, of course, is King Lear, one of my favorites, right? I love them all, but King Lear is a great play, right? And King Lear, kind of at the beginning, is this sort of weird figure. I always thought he was weird. You know, he sets up this odd sort of contest, almost like King Lear is like just breeding hypocrisy, right? Oh, hey, I got my daughters, I got a kingdom, I'm giving away the kingdom. I'm simplifying it a lot, but I'm going to split my kingdom up, and I'll split it up accordingly, you know, to you three. But I'm not just going to parcel it out easily. I'm going to say, you know, why don't you guys tell me how awesome I am and how much you love me? Well, you know, talk about setting up a contest. Like, talk about putting some people in a situation where they might be a little bit like Angelo, right? You know, like he's exposed to the sun, which could produce flowers. But in Angelo's case, when he sees Isabella, the sun, and she doesn't produce flowers, it doesn't produce flowers, it produces corruption and rot. Shakespeare seems to like that idea that, you know, that things that could produce goodness and could produce something lovely and beautiful, they can produce the evil desires and corruption. And that's kind of what Lear does here. You know, if I'm your father and I love you, tell me how much you love me, and you get a bigger slice of the kingdom's of the pie. And well, needless to say, Goneril and Regan in this love and loyalty contest, they're just like, we love you, and they're trying to outdo each other. And then when finally Cordelia comes along, we see the clash of the hypocrisy from Goneril and Regan with Cordelia's integrity, her honesty. And she's like, oh, I love you. Yeah, I love you, Dad. But, you know, I'm going to have a wife and a husband and all that stuff. And I can't, if I give all the love for you, I don't have love for my husband. And that's kind of weird, isn't it? Shouldn't I have that? And so Lear doesn't take that too well. So, and then he just spirals out of control, and he's yelling about the sharper is a serpent's tooth and an ungrateful child. And anyways, he just goes bonkers over this stuff. And anyway, so the play gets even more complicated from there. But at the root, there is this kind of appetite, right, that can be, you know, can be basically just fostered and encouraged. And hypocrisy just goes insane. And being a solid tragedy, there's death and destruction that is that is the result of it all. So Shakespeare gives us some final thoughts. He gives us this very complex, dynamic notion of hypocrisy, right? Fueled. It could be, people could have proclivities to it, and it seems that we do. So sometimes, though, hypocrisy, right, in the drunken layabouts, we think it's funny, right? We know Falstaff is this big hypocrite, and he's hilarious sometimes. So there's lots of hilarious, goofy hypocrites in Shakespeare, but again, they don't seem to be that harmful. Or if they are, like sometimes their harms are not that serious. Maybe they harm themselves, and sometimes Shakespeare can get us to laugh at people harming themselves. Not exactly showing us great things about ourselves, but hey, it's fiction. But in any case, so sometimes Shakespeare teaches us or says through his characters that maybe hypocrisy is not so bad. Maybe it's just funny. Have a good laugh, right? Falstaff's a funny guy. Have a good laugh. Kind of a guy in the bar drinking and boasting about stuff, telling tall tales, and everybody knows they're tall tales, and yet we all yell, "Tell us another one," because it's just fun. But hypocrisy, though, when we look at it, has extreme darkness and links to evil. And sometimes it's self-defeating. Sometimes it's not. It can be toxic. It can be spread. It's destructive. So, and it's not all that rare. And this evil of hypocrisy, right? We've seen Aquinas link it to lying and to sin, right? And sometimes Aquinas says, yeah, it's not so bad, but sometimes it's super bad when it leads to complete destruction. Remember Aquinas, previous video, said, hey, if you do dissimulation, hypocrisy in the form of dissimulation, getting people to think that what you're saying will help their souls when it will damage their souls, that's like a mortal sin. That's endangering souls. That's like, a sort of a metaphysical crime. And what you're doing there in this is that at the root of it seems to be the hypocrite as an exploiter, right? That people will trust. Human beings have desires and all kinds of things. And we also, Shakespeare, again, through his mastery, people want to trust. We do, like children want to trust. Lots of adults want to trust. We want to place our faith in other people to do things. We want to trust, right? It's exhausting to live without trust, right? We're not really equipped to do that. Try living by trusting no one. It's exhausting. It's a miserable existence. But on the other hand, it's a vulnerability, right? Because of our desire to trust and maybe even our need to trust in order to have healthy psychological states and to have a healthy mind. It's got to have some trust in there. But there's always that's a weakness because the hypocrite with this desire can exploit this. So trust becomes something that, yes, I can use trust, says the hypocrite. Now, but Shakespeare doesn't answer some fundamental questions, right? As Lear says, where do these hard hearts come from, right? Crickets, right? He doesn't answer it. Shakespeare doesn't have another character pop up and go, I will explain it. No, it doesn't work that way. So it's not clear where the hard hearts come from. And Macbeth, at the beginning when he's horrified, I'm a good person. Why do I have this evil desire swelling up in me? What's going on? So hypocrisy is just something that it can just happen, right? And you have to be careful about it because we're all susceptible to it. Now, maybe, and Vickers ends on a kind of an interesting note as we have Rochefoucauld, Baron Rochefoucauld, who says that honest hypocrisy is like an homage to virtue, right? It sort of pays its respects to virtue. But he says, yeah, in a sense, that might be true. But if we look at Shakespeare, maybe hypocrisy is some sort of payment of an homage to virtue before it crushes virtue in its path in order to get ultimately what it wants, some self-serving kind of endgame. All right, so there you go. That's a cheery note. We'll end on that, and that'll wrap it up for hypocrites and Shakespeare. Not all of it, but certainly what I'm going to say here. So see you next video.